One man's sport is another man's business. What this is not an attack on Clarence. What this is my counter opinions to some of his points. What this is not an explanation behind the science on drugs. For that, I tend to refer to Alex Colliari-Turner, a PhD researcher on drug use in weightlifting and a friend of Weightlifting House. Also, Clarence's knowledge on the chemical breakdown of PEDs is superior to mine. What this is, something that hopefully provides you with the other side of the coin so that you can make up your mind on drug testing in sports. Now, quick disclaimer, I like Clarence. I've watched all of his videos. I've enjoyed watching all of his videos over the last decade. Other than a few messages exchanged over the years, I don't know Clarence, but he seems to me like a good guy. Also, Clarence has, for good reason, an enormous audience, and a lot of the people who listen to him are going to believe what he says, and that makes sense. What I want to do is I want to offer the other side of the conversation, the other side of the opinion, so that people can hopefully make their minds up on what is a really difficult and complicated topic, and feel like they have all relevant information to do so properly. Now, just because I reason my way through the data and fall on the other side of this conversation than Clarence, doesn't mean that I think that all of his logic is flawed. In fact, I think that Clarence sort of navigates his way consistently through his argument in a better way than a lot of the people that I hear on the side who think that there should be drug testing. He has thought about this in a deeper way and probably a less emotionally charged way than a lot of people actually have. I appreciate a well thought out opinion that differs entirely from my own, much more than I do an opinion that sounds like my own, but that actually lacks any real thought or real substance. People who think that drugs are bad because drugs are bad because drugs are bad. I don't particularly care for arguments from people who refuse to appreciate the different cultures in which other societies and beliefs and values grow, who basically show no recognition of their own lived biases. People who simply say that because doping is against the rules means that anyone who dopes is a bad person is just, I don't think, particularly helpful to this conversation and needs to relook at this topic with a higher resolution. It's just not as simple as you're a bad person because you take drugs. The pressures that are put on young teenage girls in Thailand to take drugs by these older, dominant coaches is just one example that shows that such a line of thinking is faulty. I've spoken with many international weightlifters from around the world, many Olympic gold medalists. The cultures and values that they grew up with are entirely different from our own. A lot of my points that I'm about to go through are to do with the problems that would arise from removing drug testing. And when I weigh up both sides, I just fall on the side that testing is the better of the two options. With all that being said, here is why I disagree with Clarence. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the four main points that Clarence puts forward that fit essentially under this umbrella that anti-doping is unethical, and I'm going to talk about them and I'm going to show where we delineate logically. These 4 points are: 1, that it creates an unlevel playing field; 2, it facilitates corruption; 3, it demonizes PEDs; and 4, it forces athletes to use dangerous compounds. There are timestamps available for you also if you just want to skip to various points. Before we get to those 4 points, also, in Clarence's defense, he isn't saying that clean athletes should take drugs, or that he thinks it's okay for drugged athletes to train and compete in a tested sport. As an enhanced athlete himself, he won't compete due to the fact that it wouldn't be ethical to break the rules, and I commend that. All of the evidence that he puts forward about drug use being rampant in sport is correct. Many of the elite athletes at the top of a lot of sports have taken some form of PEDs over their career. His comment about Tomasz Zielinski from Poland is a classic example of this.
But after the retest, he actually got bumped up to 3rd place, getting a bronze medal. Later on, he tried to compete in the 2016 Olympics, but before he even lifted, him and his brother got caught with drugs.
He originally placed 9th in London 2012, and now he's up in the 3rd after the 6 athletes above him were popped. He then, later the following quad, also got popped. He also speaks about how North Korean weightlifters probably aren't being tested properly, and he's actually right about that. In fact, recent news from inside the games showed that during the last 9 months of 2020, there were several Tokyo medal contender countries who received absolutely no testing: North Korea, Iran, and Turkmenistan. He's right also that testing during the pandemic has been poor. I mean, in fact, even in the UK, which is notorious for really overly testing their weightlifters, the UK Anti-Doping announced that, this is a quote, "With the cancellation of sporting events and recent UK government advice concerning the control of the virus, we have reviewed our operational activity and are announcing a significant reduction in our testing programme." And this was a public statement, so if athletes in the UK are being made aware of reduced testing, then you can bet that many other countries from all around the world have put significantly less anti-doping pressure on their athletes over the last year. So far we're in agreement of this premise that Clarence has put forward, that there is rampant doping in our sport and that things aren't necessarily made fairer for the clean athletes by putting those measures in place. But what I want to do now is get into the 4 main points that he put forward. 1. It creates an unlevel playing field. I don't feel like Clarence is putting forward a truly convincing argument that the playing field would be level in a non-tested federation. It's almost this utopian idea that with no restraints, everything will suddenly become fair. But it seems to me that in the situations where drugs in sports are legal, then the countries that invest the most in developing better PEDs will have a significant advantage, and that the playing field will only become more unlevel. The inherent unfairness that already comes from some countries having stronger testing protocols than others will re-emerge in a world with no testing, but just in a different shape. Some countries will have better scientists, more potent, stronger drugs, better access and funding to development. It seems to me that once the ceiling blows, it will just become a race as to who can develop chemically the best doped human being. Knowing then that that is what's going to be required to reach the elite levels in the sport, which teenager is going to join weightlifting? Whose parents are going to drive their kids to the gym knowing that essentially the conclusion to them being a talented athlete is that they're going to have to take an enormous amount of gear? Essentially, a requirement to take drugs to compete would pressure athletes to take drugs when they don't want to. And again, in my opinion, this ceiling of drug use that is created by mandating drug tests is necessary to prevent too many drugs from being used. Also, as we know, humans, through their differences in physiology and endocrinology, respond differently to exogenous hormones. The romantic idea is that sport is fair and that the most talented, hard-working athletes win. But the reality of it, as I know, as you know, as Clarence knows, is that in actual fact, the romanticism of sport is in some ways not always real. It isn't always he or she who works hardest wins. And in fact, if you aren't in a country that dopes, you're going to need some premium genetics if you want to win. Drugs in some ways make this romantic idea about sports fade even more. The moment that there is a PED free-for-all, the more the training and genetic advantages that we're born with begin to sort of skew slightly more unfairly, and it no longer becomes about the athletes who are genetically gifted and who work hard, as much as it does the athletes who are genetically good responders and who work hard. Clarence's second point is that it facilitates corruption. This is actually a really interesting point, and I think the one that holds the most water. My feeling is that in unregulated large businesses, there's always going to be some kind of skew towards some level of corruption. As a group of people grows in an organization and the lack of regulation increases, people are always going to be able to get away with more and more. And this is why we find ourselves now in weightlifting, in the IWF, requiring independent investigators, because we let regulation kind of just fall by the wayside. In the IWF, the board used anti-doping as its sort of mule for corruption. There is currently an easy way to make money through this part of the sport. But I don't think that anti-doping made that corruption. It's just the current focus point of the corruption. But corruption essentially comes first and finds these weak points of transference. But there are other ways to be corrupt. Removing anti-doping wouldn't remove corruption from how people tend to act and respond in these kinds of situations. To my mind, this is just wishful thinking. There are plenty of other ways in weightlifting through which money can be transferred and pass hands under the table. Just like paying an official to change someone's body weight when they go to compete.
If anti-doping worked 100% of the time, I would actually be all for it. I just don't think anti-doping should exist because of the problems it creates.
Now, the crux of this argument to me sounds like a false dichotomy. My understanding of what Clarence is saying is that only two options exist. That either we should have 100% effective anti-doping testing or no testing at all. But other options remain. For example, better testing, improved testing, more frequent testing. And this is what we're seeing at the moment. These things are actually happening.
Like, I hear people always talk about the positives of anti-doping, but people don't realize that there's also a lot of negatives that come with anti-doping. Like, you're probably wondering, like, how is this? Like, isn't drug testing supposed to protect people and create a fair sporting environment? Like, does it really create a level playing field? Does it prevent people from having an unfair advantage over other people? Like, just looking solely at that, it actually does the complete opposite. Like, that might sound kind of crazy to you, but just think about it for a minute. Do you really believe drug testing in every country in the world is equal?
So I don't actually think that Clarence is wrong about this, but what about the problems that are created by not testing? In what is commonly referred to as Goldman's dilemma, Robert Goldman polled world-class athletes and he asked them, would you take a pill that would guarantee you a gold medal even if you knew that it would kill you in 5 years? And more than half of the athletes said that they would do it. So the population of athletes that we're talking about when we speak about anti-doping are an extremely intense-minded group of people. Their desire to win and do whatever it takes is just off the charts. The current drug testing at least places some kind of limit on how many or how much PEDs can be taken. But if we remove testing, more will be taken, and this is made clear by the fact that in weightlifting performance, other than for Lasha-Talakadze, performance is significantly lower now than it was in the 80s, where testing was even more lenient. The testing that we do have at the very least provides a limit to the individual quantity taken. And when you remove this testing ceiling to a population that answers Goldman's dilemma with yes to the question as to whether they would take a pill that allowed them to win if it meant dying 5 years later, you're essentially going to create a race to drug abuse. 3. It demonizes PEDs. Now, a quick preface to this section. I don't believe that PEDs should be illegal for the general public. I don't think that PEDs should be demonized at all for non-competing citizens. And it's for that reason I have no problem with Clarence choosing to take them or Sally from down the road choosing to take them.
Why is there a war against doping in sport? Why is PED use considered unethical? Why is it a good outcome to prevent people from using PEDs? And why is anti-doping seen as something that's ethical and necessary?
Now, these are great questions to ask, and it's truly worth considering your responses to these. I can't say I know all of the answers to these questions.
If someone isn't willing to sacrifice their health, they simply shouldn't participate.
Now, to my mind, there is a huge difference between sacrificing your own health through the side effects of competing in the sport, wearing your body and mind down through the extreme training is a cost that you just have to pay. But the cost to your body through PED use, to me, isn't something that you should have to pay. Athletes' bodies already suffer an enormous amount through the rigorous training they do. And that's good. That's how it should be. That's commitment in sport. But saying that if you aren't willing to sacrifice your health beyond training through PEDs, then you shouldn't be trying to participate just doesn't sit right with me. In the 80s in Bulgaria, there are plenty of weightlifters who complained and protested to Abajev that they wanted to take fewer drugs.
Recreational bodybuilding isn't drug tested, yet there are many that decide not to take drugs because they don't want to suffer side effects.
Now, this example of bodybuilding does a disservice to the argument that Clarence is putting forward to me. Making those sports a free-for-all in terms of the amount of drugs that can be used hasn't changed the public perception of them, and if anything, the public perception of bodybuilding and strongman is worse because of the rampant drug use. If people want non-drug tested weightlifting, which they clearly do based on Clarence's videos, which is fine by the way, then the good thing is that it is possible to start your own federation. But I don't think that the reduction in demonizing PEDs will be severe enough in the public opinion to grant the IOC this feeling that they can replace current weightlifting with free-for-all weightlifting. If bodybuilding works fine with a drug federation and a doping control federation, which like in weightlifting works a certain amount in that the bodybuilders who are tested aren't quite as big as the bodybuilders who aren't, then why should we remove anti-doping from weightlifting when we can follow in their footsteps, and if people desire, just create a second federation that isn't drug tested? I know that this is going to seem like an oversimplification, but it's almost as if we're saying that if we can't catch every shoplifter, and most people still have to pay full price for the products, then we should just allow everybody to shoplift. Now obviously that isn't totally fair, because the ethics against shoplifting are obviously far higher than the ethics against anti-doping, but I think the logic follows through. 4. It forces athletes to use dangerous compounds.
Oral trenbolone is one of the most dangerous steroids ever created. The only reason athletes used it was because of anti-doping. They probably wouldn't use it otherwise.
Now this is actually a really good point, but I think the most obvious rebuttal to me is that Clarence is making the assumption that with no anti-doping, every athlete will get access to the best possible PEDs. But that won't happen. I mean, in some countries, the drugs themselves will still be illegal domestically, and thus won't be readily available. Other substances will be treated like closely guarded secrets for the countries that do use them, and athletes that live in countries that hold certain PEDs as illegal will perform worse. Athletes who live in countries with better funding will do better. Again, both sides of this debate create an unlevel playing field. I don't think Clarence is fair in his idea that removing testing will make this sport fair. My feeling is that it will make things even less fair. It may benefit some of the countries that currently have a harder time, but in the same vein it will make many other countries, particularly those that are less economically developed, far worse off. I think another assertion made here that doesn't quite sit right with me is this idea that athletes from clean countries simply cannot compete under the current system. Given that there is a world champion from the USA and that there are an increasing number of international medalists from countries with strong anti-doping systems, it seems clear that the current system is enabling clean athletes to compete and even win sometimes, even if the system clearly isn't perfect and it does skew heavily against them. Now this last point is perhaps the most important point with regards to Clarence's point that athletes are forced to take drugs that are dangerous because of anti-doping protocols. So, a substance that is both safe and available to everybody would actually be legal under the current anti-doping rules. For a substance to be banned, it has to meet 2 of the following 3 criteria. 1, that it's dangerous. 2, that it provides an advantage. And 3, that it's unfair in terms of its difficulty to purchase or get hold of. And so this is why, for example, creatine is legal. It clearly provides an advantage, but it isn't dangerous, and it's not difficult to come by. If, however, someone developed a slightly better creatine but kept the formula to themselves and sold it only to the highest bidders, it would become a banned substance because it would violate 2 of the 3 rules. It's not dangerous, but it does provide an advantage, and it's unfair in terms of the difficulty of getting hold of it. So safe drugs, as Clarence pointed out, aren't something that can only be taken in a world without drug testing. If the drugs truly are safe, and then we make them readily available and easy for anyone to get hold of, then they would be legal substances. I think that ultimately Clarence sees that drug testing makes things unfair. And I agree with him that the current version of drug testing, where people look the other way and money exchanges hands, goes under the table, it is unfair. But I just also think that no drug testing would also be even more unfair. And the corruption that we currently see in the IWF will just resurface in a different way. People are corrupt, and corruption will always try to find a way through. Removing testing won't just get rid of corruption. I think the way to do this, and this is what we talk about all the time on the Weightlifting House News Show, is that a better managed business with more independent companies managing sensitive areas of the sport will reduce the amount of corruption that comes through. But who knows, maybe in the end we'll get so good at anti-doping that corruption will just find its way and squeeze its way into changing athletes' body weights when they go in to compete. Now, like I said at the start, I hugely appreciate Clarence's opinion, and I really respect him as a weightlifter. I think he comes to this conversation with some obvious bias. I also come to this conversation with some obvious bias. The best thing that we can do is listen, communicate, try and remove these biases from ourselves so that we can actually independently make an important decision on these things, come up with our own belief system. I hope that what this has done is provide the other side of the coin for you guys. Please do let me know what you think, not what Clarence thinks, or what I think, down below in the comment section, what you think about this whole topic. In the meantime, I'm going to sit back and wait for Clarence to finally upload his 190 snatch. I'll catch you guys next time.